our final session of the day, and I think that segment is what is going to time all the previous 5 segments that we have been having, because it's has had such a profound impact on agricultural development in CARICOM. And for this segment, I'd like to invite Vincent Atkins to the table and Neil Paul. And it's just by coincidence the 2 gentlemen happen to be St. Lucian. It wasn't by design. So Vincent Atkins has been the guy working in agriculture for the longest while as well. In the ministry, CARICOM Secretariat, in what used to be the CRNM, now the OTN. I'll explain the acronym is just not for you. But the acronyms are the back of the book, so it's Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery, recently scaled down, I would say, Vincent, into the Office of Trade Negotiations. Right, integrated into the CARICOM Secretariat. With the, I think the sub-head office is in Barbados. Right. And Vincent has been involved in the trade negotiations, WTO when it was active, and now the Canada CARICOM negotiations, under which agricultural market access is an important area. And then Neil Paul, he is with the Sridhar Ramphal Center based in Haven Campus in Barbados. And he is manager of research and development, and also is involved in the international trade program, master's program in the SRC. He's also a trained extensionist, a very good artist, a good photographer, and we have to thank him for some of the photographs used in this document on the cover. He gave it to us for free. So these two young St. Lucians are very experienced in the various fields, as well as applications to agriculture. I would like to welcome them to the round table. The segment topic is leveraging trade and economic agreements to support innovation, transformation, and food security. And these essentially wrap up the 3 topics that we have been, or the 5 previous topics that we had on the table. Before break, there was a comment made to me by Onika from Antigua. And she essentially said that she sent an email to the Secretariat Agricultural Desk asking or suggesting or inquiring about something, and the response was none too pleasant. And it had to do with, essentially, the none too pleasant response was that the WTO essentially doesn't allow this and we shouldn't do that, etc., etc. And this response that the WTO doesn't allow this, or you're not allowed under the WTO, has been something that has been bandied about almost as an excuse by ministries and by public sector why certain things cannot be provided for agriculture, why certain activities cannot be done for agriculture, and why the ministry is not able to fulfill its obligations to the agricultural stakeholder community. We are now engaged in the Canada CARICOM negotiations, which some might question why should we be, because the previous agreement really has yielded very little in terms of agricultural development in the region. We all know that the Doha round under the WTO, the World Trade Organization, has kind of been stalemate for the longest while, and nobody has much expectations of those. We all know as well the CARICOM single market economy has been on the treadmill for the longest while. And one of the more learned minds in the region who has been involved in the CSME process, Professor Grogan, when we did call him the pillar of integration, he said he felt more like the pillow, because integration is like it's sleeping. So, we have those integration movements where we think that coming together as a region is going to help us to fast-track our development process, particularly in agriculture, and yet still we're not seeing any fruits of those kinds of labors. So we have Senior Atkins here, and our first question to him is, as a negotiator, when he goes around the region and engages with people in member states, asking their information or asking their opinions or getting information for the negotiation, what is the general response of the stakeholders? Are they enthusiastic? Do they treat you like a nuisance? Or do they have any sense of urgency that you have in terms of dealing with negotiating issues?
Let me first of all thank Diane in particular, but the organizers of ART for the opportunity first to participate in this session, to the extent that it would allow us to discuss some of the issues germane to the type of work which we do within the OTN, and to contribute to this very important subject of breaking agriculture out of tradition and dependence. With specific reference to your question, the response which we receive across the Caribbean from stakeholders within agriculture, and when I think of stakeholders within agriculture, I'm thinking not just of farmers, but any stakeholder, no matter how remotely related to agricultural activity. That response depends on the extent to which the extent on which the persons involved are familiar with the contents or the issues, concerns, the interests covered by the various agreements.
I want to stop you there.
Yes?
You see the word, it depends on whether the persons involved are familiar with. Many of our stakeholders are not familiar with the contents of the agreements. Why? Because the normal thing is they are too long, the text is too legal, and really they have no clue what it is about in the first place. And the next, and when you continue on your dialogue, who is responsible for familiarizing the stakeholders with the content, particularly given the type of content you find in those kinds of agreements?
Okay. One, the question of awareness building and sensitization. That responsibility lies both at the national and regional level. At the regional level, of course, the OTN, which is engaged in the negotiations, has responsibility to consult. However, the OTN and the Secretariat generally cannot do so without the support and, in general, without the permission of the national governments. The greater responsibility...
Again.
Yes?
Permission of the national government.
Yes.
Who in the national government?
At the national level, the focal point for engagement in trade negotiations is the Ministry of Trade. So that even if the issue, even if the negotiations concern an agricultural issue, an agricultural agreement, the focal point for engagement in the international trade negotiations is the Ministry of Trade.
And I will interrupt you again, because we all know in the Caribbean, we have the Ministry of Trade as the focal point doing the negotiations, and when the subject matter is agriculture, you find very limited or inadequate discussion between the Ministry of Trade officials and the agricultural officials. And one of the reasons why you find a limited discussion is because there is a prevailing view that the agricultural officials in the ministry are not familiar, they're not trade experts, they don't know anything about trade negotiations, and therefore their interventions are not necessarily, I don't want to say meaningful, but not necessarily up to par with what the Ministry of Trade is looking for.
A view which I disagree with. I have been with agriculture for the longest while. Of course, as you're aware, was part of the FTAA process, part of the WTO process, and part of the process, of course, of the EPA and now Canada trade. And Diane, you would be aware that at the times when we organized technical working groups, at one time we organized technical working groups on agriculture, in which representatives from both the Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Trade participated. Let me make it very clear. I made mention that the responsibility lies with the Ministry of Trade. That does not mean that that stakeholders from agriculture would not participate in the sessions. As a matter of fact, when we do organize meetings of the technical working groups on trade, on market access, you will have representation directly in some instances, and that differs from country to country, representation by the Ministry of Agriculture. If I take Trinidad and Tobago as an example, you have persons from the Ministry of Planning from Trinidad and Tobago who've always participated in the technical working groups and who attended actual technical negotiating sessions. The same thing holds for Jamaica. I can point to persons who consistently from those ministries participate in those sessions, so that the responsibility may lie with one ministry, but the expectation is that the ministry would engage all stakeholders, because the issue may be that of agriculture, and again, even within agriculture, the specific expertise may not lie necessarily in one person. If, for example, the issue is an SPS issue, then you expect the expertise to come from those persons engaged in SPS. Similarly, if fisheries is the matter under consideration, and you would expect the person to be drawn from the fisheries department and that kind of thing. So you do have those persons taking part, and those persons making a very meaningful contribution. Very often, the trade expert may not be necessarily au fait with the intricacies, with the minutiae, in each of those areas, and therefore you do need the contribution of those technical experts in crafting proposals, and we do have that kind of input. We also have the input from regional entities. No one champions the cause of poultry except the Caribbean Poultry Association. And if you give agriculture the wider definition, WISPA, the West Indies Rum and Spirits Association, was engaged in actually crafting the very text which protects its industry. So there is scope for that kind of engagement.
CPA are the big guys in agriculture in the region. They are the organized people, and they know exactly what the stake is if they don't mind their business.
That's correct.
But I want to shift focus on that right. We're talking process and of negotiation and go to Neil. We had a conversation recently, Neil, when we were talking about the upcoming workshop on extension in Nairobi. And then you had a view that you wanted to do a paper on the new role of extension, where they would link directly with the trade negotiations, rolling it out, implementation of issues, etc. One of the drawbacks, one of the limitations that we've had in terms of, and why we had so much bad feeling about trade agreements and trade negotiations in the Caribbean, is that once agreements are signed, we have to see implementation. And the question becomes, Ministry of Trade is a focal point for negotiating, Ministry of Agriculture is a focal point for implementation, am I right? But at the agriculture part of the agreement. But in many instances, there is no mechanism to to go from agreement to implementation on the ground. Because the same thing we started back up with, the language is not clearly understood, there are a lot of legalities in the agreements, and nobody takes the time to break it down and put it into the implementation process. Now, Neil, you're the SRC, Trade Rampant Center. You're also involved in the course work or the course structure for international trade. Two questions. Is the current master's program of the international trade course, which I know a little bit about, does it cater to the real life issues as well as the trade negotiations are dealing with? And how do you blend the trade negotiations, the emerging agreements, the real life issues of the coursework in the school, and the need to roll out implementation at the ministry level, knowing fully well that extension is who's expected to be the ones liaising with the farmers and transforming their practices, information exchange, etc.?
Well, that's a very difficult question for me to take, but I will try to approach it from, I believe that the extension officer, whether he or she is treated from a Ministry of Agriculture or a Ministry of Trade or the university, because you can use several methodologies, right? Extension as a methodology was used by agriculture in the 70s for the Green Revolution, and was so successful that they contaminated the whole world, right? That's one. The success of extension, though, is what we're talking about. They use it in health, and they used it in family planning and so. The methodology was based on Rogers and Schumacher diffusion of innovation, and/or in recent times there's a new methodology called the cognitive dissonance, where you, instead of trying to teach everything, you look and see what is being done in a positive way in the client group, and then use that as the basis for extending the transfer of technology. So I believe that what we need to do because all the trade agreements, CARICOM, Canada, CARICOM, Colombia, CARICOM Cuba, CARICOM Costa Rica, EPA, the CARICOM DR, the amount of trade that has emanated as a result of those trade agreements is reasonably low. So, but I don't want to make a comment without having the evidence. The evidence suggests that that it is not where it should be. Let me put it this way, being diplomatic. What I believe is the answer is that either the extension officer must be trained to understand trade policy, or the trade policy people that we are putting out, and here I'm making a case for the University of the West Indies, and the trade policy people that are being put out should be employed in extension, at least one or two in each instance, to go in the same way as scientific agriculture is brought to the farmer who, in a lot of cases, did not have the understanding of the science until, well, sorry, that's not correct. The extension officer was to go between the science and practice. I'm saying that the extension officer or the extension methodology should be used to transfer the substance, the content, the technology, if you want to use it in a broad way, from the trade agreements to the practitioners who are the small private sector. I looked at the characteristics of the small farmer as we know them to be, and I looked at the characteristics of the private sector, which excludes the big guys. And I am seeing a lot of similarities. Risk averse, they are not, they tend not to be innovators, they tend to be suspicious of government and people trying to find out how much money they make because they think it's tax and tax purposes, etc., etc. So I think the methodology can be implemented to get those scientific or legal jargon, international trade jargon, to a point where the small private sector will understand what he needs to do. For example, when you talk about a mutual recognition agreement that has to be made between, they say EPA has opened all kinds of opportunities, that is true. But if the accountants want to go trade in Europe, they first have to have a mutual recognition agreement between the people in Europe and our people here, so that we agree that we have the same qualifications, we have the same methodologies, we have the same, ACCA or whatever, so that we can trade in their space and supposed to be reciprocal, that they must have something that we agree to. So, in short, I think the extension methodology has to be used to explain all of those intricacies in the agreements.
I wish to add, because one aspect of the question which you asked, Neil, was the extent to which the program which he manages is consistent with the work which the ongoing negotiations. One, I wish to make a contribution in that respect by pointing to two things. One, regardless of the negotiations, the forum in which the negotiation is conducted, there are certain overriding principles. So that if you think of reciprocity, you think of transparency, you think of notification, you think of the MFN, these are principles which will be covered in practically all the negotiations. The training offered by Niels Short treats with these principles, so that the students who graduate are familiar with the theoretical underpinnings, the principles which underpin those.
Listen, I don't want to stop.
But in addition,
I don't want to stop you too much, but you see, the discussion we had earlier on institutional stuff is a similar discussion we had on the UE one. They teach you the principles and academics of the subject matter.
I'm coming to that second element. I'm coming to that second element. In addition to the coverage of the essential theory, which you cannot undermine, you cannot discount the value of the theoretical component. The second aspect, the practical component, you do have students who are attached to the OTN for certain periods of time. You have students who are attached to the WTO office in Geneva for a period of time so that they become familiar with the processes of the negotiations and actually contribute to the preparatory work, so that by the time those students are finished with the program, they return to their home countries, to the ministry. I remember somebody asked me about Gabriel Gileno yesterday, who is now attached to the Chamber of Industry and Commerce in Trinidad and Tobago. Gabriel spent some time with the OTN in Barbados, with Geneva, and several other students, so that practical dimension certainly they benefit from. In a nutshell, I'm suggesting to you that the program offered by SRC is not removed from the actual negotiating process on the ground.
But that is good to know. And so therefore, can these graduates from your program be looked at as a possibility of the trade extensionists, where they go out and actually extend the information and the trading to But you know, sometimes extension has such a bad name in the Caribbean. Do you think that these graduates in trade would want to conceive themselves as being extensionists from that perspective?
Extension is a methodology, you know. Whether you call it.
We all know that, but you know, if you talk to anybody in agriculture and about an extension officer, the feedback is not to
we can call them a rose by any name, as you know, they say, still smells as sweet. So we can change the name if we want. But the reality is the methodology which we use, and I want to thank my friend Vince for his. I hadn't realized we had so many supporters out there. Yeah, we do. In addition to W2 and ministry, we have students. Every student is required to do an academic component, which lasts about 7 months. 2, there's a study tour to Geneva for about 17 days, where they go to interface with all the trade-related organizations, the ITC, WTO, HRF, all the ILO, all aspects of the international organizations that are related to trade in Geneva. And then they have to undertake a 3-month internship with a organization that matches the research paper that they do, a research paper of about 10 to 14,000 words. And we use, Vince has been one of our supervisors, we use people who are in the field to supervise those students in terms of their research papers, and they are attached to an organization where they intern for 3 months. So the program is sound, I think. Not I think, I know, it's sound. The reality now is to get, let me give you an example. There was, one of the students was, one of our recent students, a Barbadian student, she failed one of our core courses taught by Dr. Antoine. And she was employed at BS&T as a trade analyst. They were giving her a little half-year job. Within the first month, she was able to identify a product that the BS&T was attracting 125% duty when they really should have been attracting 25% duty, and pointed it out to them, and were able to get BS&T to make significant savings. In fact, they had to almost do a retrospective thing and gave them a credit, and to the extent that BS&T employed her full time. So that is an example to show that somebody who is trained in this area has the tools to be able to look through those, you know, a schedule is a very difficult thing to read if you don't understand it, right? And she was able to do that when she had failed a course which was considered, she subsequently passed the course. But the point I'm making is that yes, these trade policy people that we have produced can either become the trade extensionists, or people who have the agricultural background who come into our program from extension can be trained to go back out there. So however you do it, the point is the methodology of extending a scientific or a jargon-filled agreement to practice.
Okay, and before, I know there's some burning questions on the floor, but I know for a fact that some of the ministries of agriculture in the region, they're always looking for answers to questions related to trade-related issues. And they come to ICA sometimes and the FAU sometimes. Now, if you go on to look through a search, all of the answers seem to have Africa and Latin America as part of their experiences, not much of the Caribbean. You mentioned that the students do research papers. Where can we get access to those research papers? Are the research papers linked to the questions being asked in the general community for needed answers? So how does that, my point, how does it tie down into or tie back into what the ministries themselves are looking for answers for? Particularly the comment that Monica made. I know many ministries are looking for answers to how can they use those trade agreements to better help the sector. Mind you, they do know what is prohibited, but they're trying to find ways around the prohibition so they can still use them to their benefit. Where do we get access to those research papers? How can we influence research topics, etc., so that we can actually have use of them in the advice that we give to the ministries and to the, especially agriculture ministries, and to the small private sector who they deal with?
Okay, I'm pleased to hear you saying so, because when we were begging organizations like CDB and different organizations to please provide us with a list of research areas that they deem important, so that when we're looking for internships we can twin students with organizations, that seemed to have been the most difficult exercise. People will say yes, they'll do it, but they don't send in any topics. We got a couple of topics from people like the RNM, the then RNM, and so we have some of those. The truth is, this could be better. There's a dilemma though in terms of research. There's the argument that by some people that we need to direct research and direct students to research relevant areas that are important to the development of the region. And then there's the school of thought that says that academia should not be directed in such a way. Students should be, free to choose areas of inquiry that they want to. So if a guy wants to find out whether the moon is made of cheese, that it should be his or her choice. So there's that dilemma in an academic institution. But we do believe that research areas should be communicated to us so that the students have.
We have signed the EPA, what, 2-3 years, 4 years now? Hardly any CARICOM country, if any, has capitalized on it. Now we're going to sign with Canada. A real problem is understanding the EPA, not only in agriculture, for the other sectors, in practical terms. I'm asking the question in a different way. How can the ordinary businessman like myself, a creative writer, understand how I can fit in? And it has been said that there is ready opportunity for people in entertainment to function in Europe. The real problem is that people don't understand. And you see all that thing about extension workers and so on. We can't give the extension workers in agriculture more work. We need, I think, a unit in the Ministry of Trade where people with the knowledge can break it down, relate to the agencies for public information, but there must be some kind of open house, a clearing house where people can go and get information. Because we don't understand EPA. No, we got to go together and more reciprocity.
If I should make a comment on this. One, within the agreement itself, there is an institutional arrangement which should facilitate that kind of connection which you are speaking about. That is ensuring that the man on the ground, as it were, the firms, the stakeholders, the persons directly engaged in production, have a better understanding of the agreement. In the context of the EPA, for example, there is the EPA Implementation Unit, which is based at the CARICOM Secretariat, whose responsibility is, one, to assist the national governments in the implementation of EPA. Trust me, the implementation of the EPA agreement will take some time. The process of creating the necessary infrastructure, the necessary institutions.
What are the infrastructure institutions?
For example, there is the Committee on Trade and Development. There is a consultative committee the Committee on Trade and Development incidentally will involve persons or representatives from the various ministries of trade, planning, economy, and so on. There is a consultative committee involving representatives of civil society who would not just interface with government on the implications of the agreements or the impact of the agreement, but also contribute to the periodic review of the agreement and the ways in which the agreement can be adjusted. Because bear in mind that although we've signed an agreement, like any treaty, there is provision for making adjustments if there is need to make such adjustments. So that one, you have the implementation unit to assist the government, but also to sensitize the wider public. And I know Mr. Branford Isaacs, who is in charge of that unit, has indeed conducted some of those sensitization seminars on implementation. In fact, as late as April of this year, May, the first week of May, Mr. Isaacs and a couple of us from the OTN were in Haiti to conduct a national consultation, with a cross-section of persons. We were in this very hotel from the OTN to conduct consultations. As a matter of fact, my responsibility within the OTN is technical and trade policy advisor to the LDCs. I have conducted national consultations on the Canada-CARICOM negotiations and on the EPA in all the LDCs, including Belize and Haiti, along with the OECS. No, Suriname is not an LDC, it is one of the MDCs. The consultation, no, I deal with the LDCs.
Who deals with Suriname?
There is no officer assigned to the MDCs. The thinking is that the capabilities. However, if it is that the particular country wishes to have that kind of input, I would, or any other officer. As a matter of fact, we do have a private sector liaison officer who consistently interfaces with the chambers of commerce. The process of consultation, I have heard repeatedly, people complain of lack of consultation and people complain of lack of awareness. Of course there are gaps, but then the problem is not as acute. And I am bold enough to say, because I have been involved in the process very long. There are related organizations. I worked with ILO with the labor community, conducting sub-regional workshops in Grenada, in Trinidad, and in the Bahamas to cover the Caribbean. To do what? To familiarize people from the labor community with the contents of the negotiations. I have worked with FAO, with Dr. Graham, who is right here. When at the time she headed the office, she drew upon our experience in that field to conduct negotiations. Very often, when we conduct these national consultations, the representation and the participation leaves much to be desired. At the end of the day, you get
the question becomes, is there something we can do to change the process, whereby we don't do it the way we normally have been doing it, usual consultations and workshops where the usual people come and the information does not get diffused to who really needs it. And also the content of those consultations, they're still not what people are looking for when they come there. I think it's 2 years ago, we got somebody to do a little paper for us on the value-added opportunities in the EPA. And they went through the tariff schedule and said, okay, you can start raw, go intermediate, into final consumer. That's the kind of information people are looking for the tariff lines. How can we use the schedules to say, I can take orange, I can transfer it into segments, or I can make juice, or I can make pulp, and that's my opportunity that I can go up the value chain. But before you continue, we have some questions on that side.
Yeah, I just want to pick on this, on the issue that Vincent is speaking about sensitization. We can't leave it to the OTN alone. Our experience, the experience we had in Barbados, I recall, and it goes back to the institutional arrangements. While the Ministry of Trade is that official point of contact, somebody in agriculture has to be championing and leading the process. And I remember when we went across Barbados doing sensitization of farmers on the WTO agreements and so on, we couldn't depend on the OTN to come in and do that for us. We had to go, that's a very prolonged process of consultation, working with all the commodity associations, and it's a continuous process of sensitization. And therefore it takes us back to the fact that a lot of our ministries are not equipped to champion and lead the process. If you leave it to the Ministry of Trade, they cannot, at the level, the sector level.
We're supposed to have EPA units in the respective countries. They're not functioning.
Because they're not functioning. There are CSME units. I don't know how many are functioning. There are many units that we have established to take implementation, but they are not functioning.
Right.
And they're not functioning because sometimes there's only one person in it, which is a you in it, one. Secondly, the person has many other things to do. And thirdly, and importantly, the person is not sufficiently trained in that content, in that technical matter. They're not a negotiator, they're not trade specialists. So they really cannot read between the lines and give him the language of the layman.
At the same time, Diane, do not underestimate the understanding on the part, because I'm saying that from the perspective of having interface with the persons organized, particularly organized agriculture. I'm speaking of the association. Jethro Green, for example, Green, for example, who has been exposed to some of these consultations. It is, when he speaks on the matter of the EPA, it is clear that he has an understanding of what opportunities exist as to how to translate the opportunities into benefits, how to move away from the recognition that there is an opportunity to taking advantage of is another matter, which incidentally the Dominican Republic has succeeded in doing in a very substantial way on the EPA, because the Dominican Republic,
because the DR was very intimately involved in preparations and the negotiations at every single stage.
Exactly, and that was because as you said, the national government saw it fit to involve the private sector in the process from the very beginning, so that if you look at exports of rice from DR into Europe, post-EPA, you'd be amazed. If you look at exports of bananas, the 30,000 tons of bananas which were allowed to the DR, advantage has been taken. If you look at textile outside of agriculture, then the rules of origin under the EPA says that regardless of where the fabric originates, if the garment is produced within the CARIFORUM country, the garment is considered as originating. DR took advantage of that and container loads of garment. I am saying to you, it is to the extent that you develop that national capacity to take advantage of the opportunities presented by the agreement. Let me stick to agriculture, and in 1 minute, I'm Diane. If you take agriculture, for example, which we recognize from the very beginning was a very sensitive sector, and therefore we approached the negotiations with that in mind, so much so that 70% of the trade coming in to CARICOM is excluded from the requirement to reduce the tariff. In other words, we retain the protection, quote unquote, for a significant portion of agriculture. And on the other hand, every product, including now rice and sugar, every product which originates in CARICOM is entitled to duty-free entry, quota-free entry into Europe. Granted, there are still SPS and technical barriers to trade, which the agreement also makes provision for addressing, assisting countries in addressing these issues. It is to the extent that we capitalize on the opportunities and the provisions in these agreements to take advantage of the opportunities which matters. If agreements do not.
Hold on. I know what you're going to say. I know exactly what you're going to say. Let me go back to Greg.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hold on that.
I'll be very brief. I just want to finish. In relation to information though, on the agreements and understand the agreements, I still think that we have a way to go. I recall that we were doing training in the FAO Food Security Program. We went across the region, training people on the agreements and so on. A lot of people were exposed. But very often we were told that we were actually not targeting maybe the senior people in the system as we should. We were targeting a lot of people in the middle level management. And it's really come back to prove to be the truth, because very often we have seen a lot of misinformation coming from very senior levels about the issues of subsidies and support to agriculture and so on. And I want to ask whether in fact we can't have a piece of work done that we can put out in the public domain to really let people understand the whole issue related to support agriculture. Because as very often people have been saying that we can't support agriculture because of the WTO, using the WTO as an excuse, when in fact we have a lot of room. And I would really suggest if the OTN could do a piece and put it out there so that nobody can use it as an excuse. We have space, and therefore people will be aware of the fact that if we want to support agriculture, we can.
Greg Rawlings?
Before you go to Greg, let us go to Julius. Before you go to Greg.
Greg, when you get OTN to put that document together, will you send it to President Jagdeo for him to sign off on it? Because the last I was involved, when it was the RNN, producing more than 100 5-minute programs for the regional negotiating machine. At the point of through the private sector liaison, at the point of the EPA negotiation, I produced an additional 30-odd programs, which, as I seem to have a gift for doing, provoked the ire of the President of Ghana, such that he felt that the RNN was out of place, had no right to be pushing this arrangement down people's throats, though he had not held consultations in his own country, or not been part of the consultations in his own country. And that is what triggered, and I'm not saying that I triggered the destruction of the RNN. Out of that, the bitter complaint came the news that the RNN will be subsumed into the Office of Trade Negotiation. So you have a political dimension that we need to address, a political elephant in the room. The thing is that I find, you talked about cognitive dissonance. My understanding of cognitive dissonance is the ability to hold two competing ideas in your head. And that is what happens in the Caribbean, where we have a CARICOM single market and economy.
Cognitive dissonance? Yeah, that's
right. Two totally different ideas in your head. To me it's madness, but they like to call it cognitive dissonance. Where the CSME was seen as the platform, the foundation on which we compete at the global level. Now I'm just a media person, I ain't supposed to say these things, but I always felt that the RNM as it then was, the OTN as it is now, should still engage more directly with CSME. But having said that, I find it is extraordinary that the more material you produce, the content was there in podcast form, downloadable from the RNM website and the OTN website, but the more content you produce, the more I hear they're not doing anything on sensitization and public information. Because it is as if you present the content and you're really dealing with the fact that people actually don't want to engage.
That's correct.
Because they don't want the change that it represents. And let's be honest as communicators, and I'm really talking to the communicators in the room about that. That's a critical issue that we have. So the more public service announcements that are produced on CSME, I've produced some. There probably isn't a media producer in the Caribbean who hasn't, in one way or another, done a few PSAs on CSME, on CARICOM behalf, or on national government's behalf. And the more you do, the more you hear we're not doing enough, and the more pushback that you get. So we either have to find a different strategy for communicating, which I find, but when you let me know, make sure you document it, because the whole world would like to know how it is you're able to penetrate hard heads when every other part of the world, including the DR next door, the French next door, and there's another thing, we don't see the French as beginning next door in Martinique and Guadeloupe. There's IPA, yeah? Next door, we don't see that.
That in many instances, it is not that they don't know, they prefer not to know. And I use one example. If you take the issue of support to agriculture, what we generally call subsidies, ministers would prefer to say to their constituents that under WTO rules, we cannot provide subsidies, which is, to use layman's language, a lie. But then, of course, this is not diplomatic language, but so let us say rather, this is not consistent with the truth. The fact remains that there are certain allowances, certain provisions, which the agreements would provide for and would allow, which for one reason or the other, a minister may not want to promote. So that then to go out into the public and say that this A, B, C, D is allowable seems to go against the vein of what that particular official, that particular minister may want. So it's not always the case that they don't know. In some instances, they prefer not to tell them the line.
That's the point, but not the minister is not the only one who has to have an understanding of the agreement. If the stakeholders themselves know, they can contradict. We took up A because you had the A doing their own, African doing their own discussion, the Caribbean doing their own discussion, because we had deadlines. So what happens when the Caribbean have deadlines? We rush because we have a deadline, we're afraid to break the deadline. So we signed, and after the signing, when the big eruption came into the region,
but that's the point,
the president erupted and we should have.
But that's the point,
But we had already signed, we have ratified most of the time.
It is always proposed to us.
But the bottom line is, we have the EPA now. There are provisions in the EPA we can leverage to support agricultural development. The question is whether we have put ourselves in a position to take advantage of what offers us to do what we have to do. So you're ready, the test is already set, we did the test, we got a F, let's try and redo and see whether or not we can pick up classes. Basically. But the point is, not enough people are understanding of it, no matter how many sensitization sessions that we have had. Not many are willing to take the time and invest and understand it for them to put it to good use. That is the point. And therefore, when the ministers make their pronouncements, we see it as a gospel truth. That is essentially what's happening in the region.
On a point of order, it would be misleading the House if we accept the notion that the individual in question was not involved in the process. It is one of the most disingenuous acts of political maneuvering I have witnessed in my youth as a reporter. To see somebody actively campaigning against something in which he was actually part of. And I cannot accept that somewhat shallow sophistry that was practiced, saying, oh, we have to send this back, playing to a base, to a political base, and vast numbers of Caribbean people believed it.
And therefore, in follow-up to that, where therefore do you need the stakeholders if the politicians are championing something, they back off? And that's where the CAFANs come in. I want to take conversation back to the CAFANs and back to extensions. We already have the agreement, it's signed. Do we leave it to the ministers and the political directorate to be the ones responsible for implementing? Or do we take our own interest in our hands as the stakeholders, find out what is in there that we can use to our benefit, leverage it, and get on with the business of agricultural development?
It was given, the mic was given to me. I didn't take it.
Mike gave you the mic.
Yeah, Mike gave me the mic, yeah. No, I think what Barbara and you said there is along the direction I wanted to go, right? And that we really don't need to harp on the past. It's how we could move forward, right? What processes? Clearly, there's a communication gap. We hear of all of these things that went on, but there is a communication gap. And how do we bridge this communication gap? And the suggestion that you make that the institutions all get together. I just saw a note from CARICOM Secretary that the CARICOM institutions will meet in July 27th. Perhaps this is an opportunity for us to meet, right? Let me say that I hold no brief for President Jagdeo Julius, but perhaps timing is important. When he went into this charade, it was I think it was more or less either before the signing or just after the signing. Now the signing is the EPA is a federal company. We should ask him whether or not he has the same objections that he had. I suppose you really can't, right? Because he signed also, right? He signed the agreement also, right?
Ghana was one of the first countries to ratify the agreement. Ghana was one of the first countries to ratify it.
And let us relook at the documentation that Jules had prepared, and see if we could use some of them now to facilitate the information and the dissemination process, right? Because there is a problem, right? From what I'm hearing, there's a problem. Now, the other thing I think Dan mentioned, we have to organize our farmers, right? We have to organize our farmers. Look who, Werspa don't feel they're part of our culture. Actually, I just got something from them saying they want to be part of the CWA, which is the first time in about 10 years Werspa said they wanted to be part of our culture, right? CPA has money, right, to be able to organize and sensitize the farmers. But when you come out of those subsectors, we don't have an organized agricultural private sector, right? And this is why we have to work very hard in putting that things in place. And one of the things we could look at, see then, is how we could utilize this meeting to seek funding sources outside of the region to see how we could carry the dissemination process forward. So we will need some resources to do that.
It could be. What I want us to Barbados as an example, which I think is a useful example, except that the Barbados government has now kind of pulled back a little bit. They have the private sector trade team, which is a group of people trained in trade policy who are responsible for answering questions from the private sector. So they will do research. If the private sector wants something, to understand something about how much milk, what is in the agreement for milk producers and they will ask of the private sector trade team, and the private sector trade team will research it and get back to them with the practical answers. The problem though is that the private sector trade team is funded by the government of Barbados. And the current government has decided, look, this was set up by the government as an activity to help you. You must be the ones to fund it. So what they have done is they are backing away from the amount of funding. And because of the austerity measures, they say, look, we have to cut back on this. Hoping that the private sector, I believe, will take up the slack and say, well, look, this is our organization, let us pay for the research and so on. And that needs, I think, to be duplicated in other countries so that the private sector can be responsible for themselves. If they hire, the same example I gave of the young student. If you have people who understand what's going on working for you and trying to get information from you, plus our students doing the research that if you give us these research areas that you want. We have 18 students on a yearly basis. That's 18 areas that can be researched by our students.
One per country.
Exactly. So the problem is not the lack of capacity per se. There is a capacity issue, but we can deal with that if people are really willing to. I mean, how can a government be funding a private sector trade team when the private sector making plenty of money?
But the question becomes, okay, you said that's a good practice in Barbados. Is it something that the private sector in Barbados can extend its services to other member states where they can make access of that? For example, can the Trinidadian ask the Barbados private sector to do research? Can a Jamaican ask? Can a Dominican ask?
I guess they can. The reality is that they have 3 people now. There's a Vincentian working there. There was a St. Lucian who has returned to St. Lucia recently. and one other person and a secretary. So they were a small outfit, which, as I said, I think the intention was for when they set it up so that the private sector could recognize the importance of this group and fund it to the extent that it can be a full-fledged institution that would do research on anything. If you want to go into Canada, what do I need to do? You bring up the problem to the private secretary team and they send somebody out, or they do research and they come back in a week and say, look, this is what you need to do as this your company needs to do this, and you can get it. But they have not, as usual, when organizations are set up to help, we come to believe that they must do this. It's the same thing with extension. Extension is a methodology, it's not in the purview of a government. Anybody can use extension. Why is that the government must provide this function for you? You must know that you need people who are trained in this area to understand these things. So if you have a small organization or small private sector organization, pull your resources together and pay for 2-3 people to be doing the work for you. You cannot expect that the government will always be there to hand out.
I just want to remind us that the reaction to the EPA wasn't all reactive. There was a lot of proactive involvement of civil society. I mean, I can speak for WINFA. I can speak for some of the work that CPDC tried to do out of Barbados. What I found personally is that WINFA spent its own funds it acquired from its affiliates, looking at what the African response was, trying to mobilize within the Caribbean. And we when I was a member of the board, paid people, the Crevilles and things of this world, to actually go and research, pull the legalese out, tell us what it meant in ordinary English, and organize farmers in meetings in Barbados. I mean, Vince, you can bear me out on some of this. But I always got the impression that it was antagonistic, that part of our own regional machinery saw us as a nuisance. And I got that impression, that distinct impression. When we tried to ask for information, it was always, well, on the one occasion that I know of personally, the response was that it was at a sensitive stage. Now, I don't know how sensitive my own business could be for me, because you negotiated on my behalf. So I don't know how sensitive it could have been, but that was the official response. And that bears no, me saying because I was there. But there has been consistent, educated responses to the EPA. People took, genuine information out of what the possibilities were, what we saw as some of the likely outcomes, both good and bad. And we put that to the public. But the thing is that there was a wave on at the time, and there was a speed with which the thing was going to be done, and that was that.
Okay, we have the agreements. They're there. There's nothing to do about them now. We still have to engage in negotiations with the preferred partners. We know that there is a problem in terms of information, in terms of understanding the whole process, and in terms of relating to people that there are benefits to these things. In terms of going forward, we know the OTN has its work to do. The SRC has a particular responsibility. We know that they are the CAFANs, they are the ICAs, they are the FAOs, they are the whole set of organizations. As a way forward, and following what Dr. Chesney said in terms of getting the organizations to meet and discuss how we can try to bridge that information gap and disconnect. The CARICOM is going on. DOE is at a stalemate. There's an EPA implementation unit. What is the best and most proactive and most, I don't say shortcut, the quickest way forward where we can, between now and the end of the year? If you look at the back of the page of the book, we have on page 42 to 41 to 43. We have a series of meetings and conferences of various stakeholders and things going on, where they all planned on their own, there's no really connection among them. Is there a possibility of influencing or doing something where at every point in time, we can roll out some information related to the subject matter that has some bearing on the information or the workshop topics? Because it can't be a 1 month, we have this consultation and it lasts until next year, and then it doesn't work. It has to be a continuous discussion, because trade policy now is heavily integrating domestic agricultural policy. We don't speak agricultural policy now in the region. We don't talk in trade policy. Whenever we talk domestic agricultural policy, it's how we can protect, how we can support, and it's all international trade policy. So there must be a way we can integrate the discussions and have some kind of presence felt in those discussions. Now, just to point your attention to CAFAN as a production, planning, and scheduling workshop. On the agenda, there is room for rolling out the food security policy, the agribusiness development policy, and a whole host of policies on the table. Is there a possibility of giving to the stakeholders of CAFAN, the 500,000 plus represented, what are the implications of your discussions and the decisions you want to take? How can you use our existing trade agreements to leverage what you're trying to do? And how are your areas of interest represented in the current CARICOM kind of negotiations? And if there's a particular trade issue that you're not too sure of, they don't understand, how can we indicate to the SRC to have some students there do some research and get back to you? Because I'm sure plenty of us in the room, or plenty of you in the room don't know that Neil has students who can do a little bit of 1, 2, or 2 page papers for you on specific little topics for almost free, right Neil? For almost pro bono. For almost pro bono. So, I mean, we need to be able to integrate our discussions in the region because one is not separate. Trade policy is now integral to domestic agricultural policy. And all the ministers want to know, whether it's for genuine reasons or for political reasons, how we can support agriculture. And like we did since started off with, subsidies is either a good word based on where you are or a bad word based on where you are. And I noticed Vincent's comment or response to when I think somebody on the FAO Caribbean Forum talked about what Antigua was doing. Vincent said you shouldn't put that out in the public domain because it's a prohibited act.
Exactly.
But many countries are doing it under the law.
That's and which I don't object to because Antigua raised it this morning when she spoke of the policy that was being used by Antigua to address the surplus of agricultural commodities. And I reacted on the FAO side and said, all well and good, do your do, but do it quietly because what you are doing is contrary to what you signed to. I was not going to say to you not to do it, but then please do not do it in such a way that you expose your underbelly because you are using a method. The developed countries find ingenious ways of getting around the agreements. I will be the last person to tell a developing country not to do the same. But in doing so, use some wisdom so that I would not put it in the public domain unless I know that it is consistent with what I have agreed to. As to whether or not the principle, the policy is right, is not the issue that I am addressing. It is the legality of what is being done and the exposure of the country to challenges. Then in closing, of course you realize I said nothing over the past day and a half, so I have every right to say it as much as I can. But let me say as my final remark, and in relation to the theme that given the spread of issues which we discussed over the past 2 days, and notwithstanding the fact that we did not go into much detail with respect to external policies, particularly external trade policies, there is indeed scope for leveraging external trade agreements to address some of those issues. And I use one, food security. When we thought of food security, I was saying to myself, it was almost as if we were equating food security with food self-sufficiency. Because we were almost speaking as if we're speaking of production, domestic production, to satisfy domestic needs, without bearing in mind that one significant element of the food security equation is that of accessibility. The food must be available, but it must be accessible to the persons who require it, so that even if there is a surplus, if the persons within your domestic community who require that food cannot access that food, you still have a food security problem. How do they access it? You must create means. And what means? Income raising means. The income-raising means may entail both domestic sale, regional sale, as well as extra-regional sales. You need to increase the income of persons so that they can acquire the food, whether the food is produced domestically, which is preferred, or the food is or has to be sourced from outside. Because a capitalist like Steve would tell you there may be scope, or there is scope for creating the kind of environment which would allow for sourcing of certain food products which may not be available locally, or which may be available only at an exorbitant price from outside. But the means must be provided. We need therefore to ensure that the agreements which we sign are such that the opportunity would be granted for our persons to find a niche within their own market, so that you do not allow external supplies to displace our local producers, which has happened to a large extent because of unbridled competition. You want to ensure that you give certain measures of protection, and at the same time you want to ensure you create the kind of climate which will enable our domestic producers to enter the external market, so that they are not focused purely on their relatively small internal market, but how best they can penetrate the external. So that in doing all of that, we certainly would be addressing the issues which we spoke about over the past 2 days, and in effect, trade agreements do provide an opportunity to which can be leveraged in order to meet our objectives in agriculture. I will end at that.
But the experts do say that we need to have an external kind of openness, because trade drives innovation, it drives transfer of technology, and therefore the more of that you have, the more developed your sector can become, whether it's appropriate technology, of course. And we know that there's a huge plus in the trade agreements to link environment and trade. Therefore, we have a whole slew of environmental standards now coming as part of the trade agreements, and therefore it also provides an opportunity to legalize, so to speak, or legislate for the environmental, green and clean issues. It provides you protection on food security issues, so you can almost do what you want under the blanket of food security, which is what's happening in the world today. Because of the food security crisis, many countries are resorting to prohibitive measures under the WTO to protect themselves. And the time the WTO was signed, the crisis was not nowhere near in the air. So therefore, the WTO did not really take that kind of environment into consideration. And that is why they're not coming down too hard, particularly developing countries who are using prohibitive measures under the umbrella of protecting our food security. And that is why I suppose the Doha will re-energize itself eventually to take into consideration the changing global environment, where everything is now completely different from 1994, when all of the WTO was in the air. And it is in that context why many developing countries are being as brazen as saying that they're doing those things, because they know they might not get a slap on the wrist because of the situation in the world today. And from that context, we can, unless anybody has a burning issue, the trade negotiations and the trade agreements have to be very well understood, very well dissected, and integrated into our domestic planning cycles. Otherwise, we'll lose out on opportunities to leverage them for our benefit.